All right. So welcome back to racial and ethnic minorities. And this week, we're talking about the new Jim Crow. We're talking about race and crime, the criminalization of race, the criminalization of Black people, and the larger issues around things like mass incarceration, hyper policing, unfair policing, essentially race and the injustice system. So that's what we are discussing today. So this is for the days of October 4th, October 6th, and October 8th. So make sure you follow this PowerPoint. Make sure you follow where we're going on the PowerPoint, the lecture video, and all of the directions that are on this PowerPoint. Okay. With that being said, first thing, you will have a quiz 2 on Essay 4 on October 11th. So this is the very next slide. Quiz 2, Essay 4 on October 11th, okay? That will be Monday, October 11th. You will have a quiz. It will cover the reading, Essay 4, Racialization of Islamophobia. So that's where the information is going to come from for your quiz, okay? The quiz will be 5 to 10 questions. It'll be related to the reading. The questions to the quiz will be available under files. It will say reading quizzes. It will say quiz 2 Islamophobia at 1 p.m. on Monday, October 11th. So you're going to have 24 hours until 1 p.m. October 12th, Tuesday, to complete it. So just like last time, this will be your quiz, 24 hours to complete it. Quiz 2, as soon as 1 p.m. hits, you'll see it available Monday, October 11th. On a separate Microsoft Word document, you will record your answers to the questions. You will go to the assignments link and click on reading quizzes, and you'll find the answers there. I'm sorry, you're reading quizzes and you'll find the portal that says Quiz 2 Islamophobia, and there you will upload the answers. You will upload the answers there. No submissions after the deadline will be graded under any circumstances. If you have questions, reach out to me during my office hours, and I will be more than happy to assist you. You can email, you can inbox me. I'll be more than happy to help. Again, the deadline for the quiz is 1 p.m. October 12th on Tuesday. So by now, because most of you did the first quiz, you kind of get a sense of how all the rest of the quizzes are going to be. So that is what is happening. Also, you have a class assignment. So this lecture is not going to be as long because your class assignment is going to be pretty long, okay? But I think you're going to find it interesting. If you haven't already done this, then it's cool. If you've already seen it, then you get to watch it again. But your class assignment, for this assignment, you are required to watch the documentary below called 13th. I don't know if any of you have ever seen 13th. It came out years ago, 2014, 2015, something like that. But it was a documentary by Ava DuVernay. She's a very world-renowned director and writer. And she's done some big films. A lot of her films are typically socially conscious or about history, but she's also done just some kind of lighthearted stuff as well. But Ava DuVernay did this film called 13th, and it's basically a film about this topic. It's a documentary. It's really fascinating. I'm pretty sure it won a bunch of awards. And if you haven't seen it, if you are in sociology, or if you are in political science, or even if you're in criminal justice, whatever, if your major is somewhere around there, this is an absolute must-see point blank period, right? It's something that you have to watch. It's very much in tune with your reading, very much in tune with the reading of the new Jim Crow. The sister from who wrote the new Jim Crow, the chapter out of your reading, she is on the documentary, and Michelle Alexander. And again, just a really, really powerful text. So you are going to watch the documentary and you will answer the questions 13th, which can be found under the online assignments or class assignment. I think it's called class assignment for you guys. Class assignments tab that says 13th. So it's going to say 13th assignment. So basically what you're going to do is as you're watching the documentary, you're going to find the answers to the questions. So they'll be in order. So all you have to do is just pull up the documentary questions. And then as you're watching the documentary, write the answers. Okay. As you watch the documentary, write the answers. Obviously you're doing this on your own, so you can always go back and then fill in the answers. If you think you missed it and you want to go back. So what you're going to do is you're going to look at a question, and then you're going to look at a question. And then as you're watching the documentary, when you get to that, when you hear that question, make sure you pay attention, get the answer, and then you can pause the video, type the answer, and then keep going. So you're going to find the answers to the questions as you're watching the film. It's going to be in order. You can record the answers on a separate Microsoft Word document. You can do it on the same document and then just save it with the answers if you want to, or whatever. Once you have completed all the questions, you will upload your answers to the assignments tab that says 13th assignment. The deadline to complete this task is October 11th. So if you're watching this October 4th, you got 1 week. If you're watching this October 10th, you got 1 day. So October 11th, 12:50. If you're still confused, if you're not sure, look at the lecture video. So some people don't look at the lecture videos. You might just look at the PowerPoints. If that's what you're doing, look at the lecture video. Then if you still don't understand, if you're still not sure, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to explain it to you. Please see the lecture video for this PowerPoint where I explain it in more detail. So again, click on that link. I didn't even know they had it on YouTube. I thought it was only on Netflix, so I didn't want to assign it because I didn't know if everybody had a Netflix account. But yeah, it's on YouTube. So you can watch it. It's about an hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes. I think they cut it down because I think on YouTube it was, on Netflix it was a lot longer. So I think they cut it down. But yeah, it was, it's a really, really, really good piece. You'll probably be into it. You probably will forget you're even doing an assignment because it's very captivating. So, and if you've seen it before, then this is your opportunity to see it again. It was interesting for me to watch it again when I was making the assignment. So that is that. If you have any questions, reach back out to me. All right, so going to the next slide, YouTube link. This is a quick clip, not long. I want you to watch this clip, and then I want you to answer these questions. Well, actually, just go ahead and watch the clip, and then pause it, and then come back, and then we'll look at these questions. All right, so what underlying message is being portrayed in this scene by the character of the police officer? So this is a funny film. I don't know if you've ever seen it. The full movie, it's a comedy. But sometimes even in comedies, there's something that is being portrayed, right? There's something that is being kind of shown, or a message that is being sent. So what kind of message do you think is being portrayed in this scene by the character of the police officer. And then what kind of message is Montgomery trying to send? Right? And Montgomery is the black guy. Martin, for those who aren't familiar with the comedian Martin, very famous comedian in the 90s and the 2000s. And they're saying that, you know, they asked him, why is it that you didn't shoot this black guy, right? Because to the other police officers, he looked like he was gonna do something wrong. And Montgomery says, oh, you talking about the brother? The black guy? Obviously he's afraid, right? And he shows all of these other ways that from his perspective, this guy wasn't gonna do anything wrong. And it's a joke and, you know, it's kind of expected to laugh, but it very much relates to the reading today. And how does it relate to the reading today? Right? Something to think about. If you did the reading, you can see that it deals with criminal stereotypes. Who is seen as the criminal? Who is looked at as being the one that deserves to be shot or to be apprehended versus someone who may not look like it? And sometimes it depends on the person looking. If you're from that community, if you're from a community where, because Montgomery was a black person looking to be a police officer, but he came from that community, to him, this guy, this cutout, didn't look suspicious to him because maybe that looked like his neighbor or somebody that he, or his uncle or something like that. So it didn't look suspicious to him, but maybe an outsider, and particularly they're kind of playing on the race concept. So to a white person, this person looks suspicious. And that idea of suspicion is typically what we see when people are assessing or critiquing policing, particularly in urban areas, particularly in Black areas, when people are looking at this idea of policing. Why is it that African Americans are oftentimes the ones more likely to be arrested, more likely to be accosted, more likely to be handcuffed and sent to jail, even if they didn't do something wrong, more likely to you know, die at the hands of the police if the interaction does not go as smoothly as everyone would want it to go. And so the question remains, is it because there's a gap in the system or a flaw in the system? Or is it because there's a flaw in the system, or is it because there are actual actions being done by that particular community that are causing these results? Okay, so it leads us to go to page 73, essay 7. And if we go to page 73, essay 7, I want us to look at the bottom paragraph. And this paragraph where it says prominent sociologists, kind of gives us a look at this idea of racial stereotyping, okay? So we've talked about Michael Omi and Howard Winott before. Omi and Winott, they were the sociologists who came up with, do you remember? They were the sociologists who came up with the theory, what? Racial formation theory. So it says prominent sociologists Omi and Winott note that we often use physical attributes, including articles of clothing, such as a hoodie, as mental shorthand for racial scripts. However, it is important to note that our racial cues are not limited to a hoodie or other articles of clothing. We use physical attributes such as skin tone, facial features, and hairstyles to make racial assumptions. Accordingly, the social psychological processes described here relate to other forms of stereotypical thinking, such as assuming that anyone who looks Mexican is illegal, that all Asians are good at math, that most Arab Americans are terrorists, or that all Native Americans are alcoholics. These are stereotypes or oversimplified sets of beliefs about members of a particular group. Okay, so this is a key part of what we're talking about when we're talking about race, selective perception, stereotype. The title of this essay is If Only He Hadn't Worn the Hoodie. And typically we talk about this, and this became extremely significant when we saw the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. If you're from Florida, well, it doesn't really matter if you're from Florida. You grew up in the United States in the past 10, 15 years, you're very familiar with this story. But especially if you're from Florida, because it happened nearby in Sanford, Florida. And Trayvon Martin, a Black boy, he was a kid, he wasn't 18 yet, was wearing a hoodie, and he was walking home from the store. And walking home from the store, he was followed because somebody felt like he looked suspicious, that he felt that he fit a stereotype, these simplified beliefs about what a criminal looks like. This individual, George Zimmerman, confronted Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin didn't know why this man was following him. This man was following him. He defended himself against George Zimmerman, and George Zimmerman admitted to approaching him, and eventually Trayvon Martin was killed. So these stereotypes, these ideas of selective perception, is something that is used a lot of times by people, sometimes by people in superior or people that are in authority, that are law enforcement, and it can be fatal for people of color. Stereotypes are not always something that is negative. There are also so-called positive stereotypes, like all Asian people are smart or all white people are rich, right? But regardless of if it's something that's seen as positive or negative, stereotyping is not good. Now, it's something that we all do to some degree, right? We may not base our final solution off of that, but we can only see the world through our own biases, and we all have bias. We have it in research. That's why we do everything we can as researchers to minimize the bias, but we can't completely ignore it. So one of the best ways when not ignoring it is just confronting it and say, hey, this is my bias. This is who I am. This is my social location. I'm going to see life from the perspective of a white woman, middle class, whatever. I'm going to see from a Latino, upper middle class professional man, right? Everybody has their bias. So it's okay. But we have to do our best to move and look past stereotypes, look past bias when we're making decisions. Again, stereotypes are not just limited to articles of clothing. Stereotypes could be linked to the skin color a person has. It could be linked to the type of music a person is listening to. It could be linked to the language that they're using. It could be linked to anything. I just read an article. This was interesting. This came up, and Serena Williams had won. This was happening in 2012. Serena Williams had won a match. I think she beat Maria Sharapova, and she was excited. She was happy. She started doing a dance. The dance was called sea walking. Sea walking is short for crip walking. right? Or the C is short for Crip, and the name of the dance was Crip walking. Crips was what is now seen as a gang. Originally was a neighborhood organization that was put in place to help protect people within that community. Over time, it transitioned and is now popularly seen as a gang. A gang that has done some positive, but a gang that has also done some negative things as well. A gang that was started in California. It was started in California as a neighborhood organization. It still exists now, but it's more popularly known as the Crip Gang. There are many of those gangs, many of those organizations in California, particularly in Compton, where Serena Williams is from. Okay, so she was very close to, or was very familiar with this walk, with this dance, with this culture. So when she won the match and she's on the world stage, she gets excited. Her culture, where she's from, comes out and she starts to do this sea walk, this Crip walk. And people got upset. People were writing think pieces. How could she do this? How could she promote gang culture? She is an icon. She is an idol. And she's celebrating these gangsters who come out and they kill people and they hurt people and they rob people. And so these were the things that were being said about her in this article. And it kind of reminded me of what we're talking about today. She was not necessarily promoting gang activity. This particular dance was a dance that had become popular. So people all over the world are doing this dance. They got popular from rappers, and then everybody started to do it. But to suggest that this particular walk represented a violent culture or violent people was somewhat of a stereotype, for sure, especially in not knowing this particular group, not knowing the people, not knowing the organization or where it came from and how it became what it became. It was very much kind of a stereotype that this particular dance done by this young lady who's from this area automatically equates to gang culture, or negative aspects of gang culture, right? So definitely stereotypes or ideas or generalized assumptions about things are related to not only articles of clothing, skin color, language, and even a dance. All right. Let's go to this idea of selective perception. Selective perception is when a person sees only the types of behavior that confirm their stereotypes and not the ones that refute them. And so oftentimes when we approach people, we can oftentimes approach people and only see what we want to see. And we've all done it. It's not specific to one race or one group or one gender, but sometimes we only see what we want to see. We have the selective perception of a person or a group of people. And when we are looking for a stereotype, then oftentimes that's what we see. And many times that's all we see, if that's what we want to see. So we think we have an idea about a person or about a group. And then when we see that group, all we think about are those things. So if a person has a negative view about Latino men, and then they see a group of Latino men on a street corner, sitting down, talking, eating, chilling, speaking their language, whether they're speaking English or whether they're speaking Spanish or whether they're speaking a little bit of both. There are these automatic conclusions that come up, these generalized stereotypes. We only see what we want to see. Oh, they must not have a job. They could all have jobs. We have these stereotypes. We only see what we want to see. They're all illegally here. They could all be citizens. They could have all been born here and been legal. So there are all these stereotypes and there are all these ideas and behaviors that we only want to see, right? And so, oh, they all must be violent or participating in criminal behavior. Not necessarily. We don't know anything about those people, right? So that is a very, very important part of this idea of selective perception of what we're talking about today. All right, so let's go to page 76, essay 7, page 76. And let's look under the section where it says if he hadn't been wearing a hoodie. And so when we look at this idea of the hoodie and how it played into the Zimmerman case, we also have to look at the certain assumptions and claims around this idea of a hoodie. The first idea is that a hoodie, and thus anybody who's wearing a hoodie, is suspicious. Anybody who's wearing one is suspicious. So in other words, there is something about hoodie that makes anybody who wears it threatened. Is that true? Is that an accurate claim? Well, let's think about it. I don't know if that's an accurate claim. Because let's think about people who wear hoodies. I would encourage you to Google Mark Zuckerberg hoodie. See what he looks like. He wears hoodies all the time. I would encourage you to look up Bill Belichick, coach for the New England Patriots. He wears, every time I see Bill Belichick, he's in a hoodie. It could be summertime and he's in the hoodie. College students, if you were to go outside, go on campus, go step out of your dorm and just walk around campus, I'm pretty sure you'll see several students across racial groups wearing a hoodie. Would you say that Mark Zuckerberg looked suspicious in his hoodie, or Bill Belichick looked suspicious in his hoodie? Or an Asian college student looks suspicious in their hoodie? Probably not. It probably would not cause you to think that they're doing something wrong. Even if you didn't know Bill Belichick, or even if you didn't know what Mark Zuckerberg looked like, you see them and say, oh, I don't think they're going to do anything wrong. But when George Zimmerman had the hoodie on, and it was February, so it was cold, he had a right to wear a hoodie. Not George Zimmerman, sorry, Trayvon Martin. He looked suspicious. He's not the only one. That is an idea that is associated with crime, or people say the hoodie is associated with criminality, but it's not the hoodie itself. It's who's wearing it. So the criminality is oftentimes associated with what? Not the hoodie, but the person wearing the hoodie. Because if a different person was wearing it, it wouldn't necessarily be the same, many times have the same effects. So again, talking about race, talking about selective perception stereotypes. And this is very important because this leads us to our next reading, which is The New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow was written by Michelle Alexander. And Michelle Alexander wrote this piece. I don't know when, like the actual year she wrote it, but I want to say it came out in like 2010. And when it came out, I mean, it just shot up. It was a bestseller. It was huge, 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 huge. It's still huge. I would say probably one of the most significant books to date, across disciplines, whether you're political science, sociology, criminology, whatever, law. She was a lawyer. Michelle Alexander was. She was a lawyer, then a journalist, But definitely one of the most significant texts of the 20th century, in my opinion. Right, that one, Du Bois's The Scholar Denied, as well as Du Bois's The Scholar Denied and Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. To me, are like probably the three more significant books written in the 21st century. But definitely this text, especially around like race, politics, etc. But definitely this one is a big one. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And she's writing this book to tell us essentially and to challenge the idea that we are now living in a post-racial or a post-Jim Crow era. And her argument essentially is that we're not. And that during slavery, and a lot of this comes from I don't know if you've ever seen this documentary, it's really good. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And it kind of sets the stage for what she does with the new Jim Crow. But basically it talks about how right after slavery, you have this amendment, the 13th Amendment, that says that we cannot enslave people on US soil ever again, right? So that's constitutional. You cannot officially have slavery. But there is a caveat to that amendment if you keep reading. And that caveat says, unless they are guilty of committing a crime. So people say slavery has been prohibited on US soil, and it has not, because you can actually still have slavery, technically, according to the Constitution. You just cannot have it without first proving that somebody has committed a crime. Okay, or suggesting that they committed a crime, because there are a lot of innocent people in that, and it has not been proven, and yet many of them sometimes are in jail 2-3 years. If you watch the documentary, you'll see a brother by the name of Khalif Browder that happens to him. So you don't even have to be guilty or found guilty. But I say all that to say that is why that documentary, Slavery by Another Name, was written, to show that the US prison system is really another form of enslavement. And it is just a different way in which people have allowed for, or the US government has allowed for slavery to continue. Michelle Alexander says, doesn't disagree, but says it's actually more of a new Jim Crow. She says that the Jim Crow era was used to relegate Black people, particularly Black people in America, to a second-class citizenship status, right? Making it so that they did not have all of the same rights and opportunities as white people in the United States. That's what Jim Crow did. We already talked about it in 1964, Civil Rights Act. All the acts of the 1960s and early 1970s helped to do away with that. However, she argues within that same decade of the 1970s, started this idea of the war on drugs. And the war on drugs was then used to fuel mass incarceration, which was now put in place to help relegate Black folks back to second citizenship status, to the point where she stated, I don't know if they say it in the documentary. I don't know if you can do the assignment before this lecture or after, it doesn't matter. But stated that, but I know she says it in the book, that there are actually more Black people under the prison industrial system, so either in prison or on parole, under the prison system now than there were so-called slaves in 1850. So she's saying we have more people enslaved, more people in chains, not necessarily just in prison, but even when you're on parole, you still can't do a whole lot of stuff. It's like being outside, but you're still in prison. And a lot of people stay on parole for sometimes 5, 10, 15 years. and you do one thing wrong, you get a ticket, you back in jail. So it's almost like being in jail, essentially. And she says more people like that at the height of mass incarceration, which was about probably, yeah, maybe like in the 90s, but definitely still extremely high today. Higher than it should be. It's getting better, but it's definitely higher, way higher than it should be, and the highest in the world. In the U.S. is higher, is highest in the world of putting its own citizens in prison. And she's saying that it's really exactly like Jim Crow. It's exactly like Jim Crow. And this is why she calls mass incarceration the new Jim Crow. And it was out of this book and this research that helped. Really, I mean, people are already fighting about this, fighting to protest this, but it just really just awakened the eyes of politicians and leaders, people. So between Slavery by Another Name documentary, Michelle Alexander's book, and then this documentary, 13th, now mass incarceration, the prison industrial system, all of these things have now been at the top of people's political campaign, has been the top of presidents who are running for office. They have to mention and talk about prison reform. They have to mention and talk about how they are going to decrease the number of people in prison because it's not helping the levels of crime that exist in our society. So with that being said, we're going to go straight into talking about the war on drugs. So the war on drugs, that is this slide right here, was really, again, this thing that kind of was the impetus for mass incarceration. Now, it's important for us to ask the question, why are some drugs legal and other drugs illegal today? And the fact is, it's not based on any scientific assessment of what drugs are legal or are more dangerous than others, but it has everything to do with who is associated with what drugs. So for example, if you look at the first anti-opium laws, if you know anything about, if you come from history or the history department, the first anti-opium laws was in the late 19th century, and they were directed at Chinese immigrants. Well, opium was forced upon the Chinese in the late 19th century to destabilize their society by Europeans. They were forced to have opium in their country. And the Chinese fought it and fought it and fought it, but they just weren't as strong as the British Army. So that's what happened. And so when they came to the United States, you had these anti-opium laws that were put in place, even though opium was something that was being consumed by people before Chinese immigrants got to the United States. But when they got there, they knew that Chinese people were so-called known for opium because it was forced on them by the British. And so now you have these anti-opium laws that are saying, hey, if you get caught with it, you'll get put in jail. Why? Not because they necessarily thought it was bad, but because now it was a drug that was associated with Chinese people. The first anti-cocaine laws in the South in the early 1900s were directed at Black men. The first anti-marijuana laws were directed at Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans. And today, Latino and especially Black communities are still subject and widely disproportionately sentenced and accused of being the sellers and the buyers of drugs. So again, oftentimes it's not the drug itself that's the problem, it's who is seen as being the ones that are using the drugs. So we'll get more into that when we talk about Reagan. So one thing that's important for us to know about the war on drugs is that it was started with Richard Nixon. A lot of people think it was started with Ronald Reagan. That's kind of the popular idea. But it was really Nixon. He was the first president to declare technically a war on drugs. And while it was not at its peak during his time, he started it essentially in 1971. And what he did was he increased the size and the presence of a lot of the federal drug control agencies. Right? He was the one that pushed measures through to suggest that we should have mandatory sentencing. The idea of no-knock warrants. The same no-knock warrant that got Breonna Taylor killed a year, 2 years ago. Yeah, that was started by Richard Nixon. Now, I think in Kentucky specifically, but I don't know if it's like that everywhere, they're doing away with no-knock warrants because of how this sister got killed. She wasn't the first. Plenty of people have gotten killed. But this particular instance just was the one that was big. But Nixon was the one that did that. He was also the one that temporarily placed marijuana in a Schedule I drug category, making it the most restrictive category of drugs. Why? Nobody knows. Well, we know why. But it didn't deserve to be there because if we're honest, marijuana is just not as dangerous as other drugs, as legal drugs. It's not even as addictive. There's a lot of science that shows that cigarettes are actually more addictive than marijuana is. Marijuana does not oftentimes lead to as many negative results or negative behaviors as other drugs. Now, again, I don't want it to be said that Dr. Grant told you to go smoke marijuana. I'm not saying that. I'm not in charge of your life. What you do on your own time is your business. But I'm just speaking the facts, right, and the science. And so science has shown that marijuana, although it is illegal in many places, is now becoming decriminalized because a lot of the science is showing it's not as bad as many of the other drugs, and is even some of the things that are legal. When you talk about people who are alcoholics, some of the results and some of the behaviors of people that are alcoholics are many times more dangerous than the behaviors and the results of people who smoke marijuana. So again, it was put in this category not because of the science of the results of people who consume the product, but because of who the product was, who was socially associated with. And marijuana in the 70s was associated with poor people, working class people, Black people, artists, Hollywood. These were the people that stereotypically consume marijuana. I mean, if we're honest, everybody does marijuana. Everybody does drugs. Not everybody, but people from all groups do drugs. Upper class people, upper class white people, upper class Black people, middle class white people, middle class Black people, Asian people, Latino people of all classes, people of all classes, races, genders, non-binary, people from all professions, politicians, artists, Hollywood, preachers, teachers, everybody. Everybody from all over. When I say everybody, I mean people from all groups participate in drug use. So drugs are not just something that is concentrated in one particular group. However, again, selective perception, stereotypes, there are these stereotypes around who does what drugs. And that is oftentimes what makes certain drugs legal and illegal over other drugs. So this is what Richard Nixon started. After Nixon, who's after Nixon? Nixon, Ford, Carter, or Nixon, Carter, Ford, I can't remember. And then after that, you have Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan comes up and he takes this war on drugs, but he expands it. Presidency of Ronald Reagan started a long period of skyrocketing rates of incarceration. Unprecedented expansion of the drug war. So it was because of him that it got to the height that it got to. The number of people behind bars because of Ronald Reagan for nonviolent drug offenses increased from, it was about 50,000 in 1980. And Richard and Reagan was the president all throughout the 80s. By the time you get to almost the end of the 90s, it's 400,000. 100,000. So it increased by what? What would that be? What, 800%? 8 times? Something like that. 400,000 by the end of the 90s. So between what Reagan did and then Bush for a little while and then Clinton did, as Clinton is his we'll talk about Clinton in a second, as Clinton's time in office is coming to a close, by the time you get there, it's 400,000 people. It's a lot. A lot. Ronald Reagan, again, expanded this war. And in addition to that, this is where you start to get the discrepancies between, again, drugs. Not because one is more dangerous than the other, but who is socially associated with one or the other. And this is where you get the discrepancy between cocaine and crack. So cocaine is seen to be a pure form of the actual drug coming from the cocoa plant. In places in the middle part of the Central America and South America, right? So you have the cocoa plant, and then the cocaine that comes out of that. The more pure it is, less of other substances that are put in it to dilute it, the more expensive it's going to be. And so cocaine, it tends to be, depending on how pure it is, tends to be more expensive, meaning the only people that can afford it are rich people. And who was associated with money? White people. So in the 70s and in the 80s, oftentimes the people that were seen doing cocaine, even now, when you look back at the movies and all of that, you see Hollywood stars, musicians, artists, famous people. If you look at old documentaries, movies from the 70s and 80s, people in Studio 54 and all those places, these people are more likely seen to be doing cocaine. You know, you've seen it. Wall Street bankers, people who have a lot of money, so they can afford a very expensive cocaine habit. Crack cocaine, on the other hand, is a more diluted form of it. It gets you high quicker, but it's not sustainable. The high doesn't last as long because it's diluted with other substances. So crack, because it's diluted, it gets you high, but not as long. Because it's diluted, it is less money, so you can sell it for cheaper. So now, other people are able to get high. People that don't have as much money, working class people, poor people, people living in poverty. These people now can do what the rich people were already doing, getting really, really high. But now there is a lower form of it. And so that's what happens when somebody plays with it and figures out, oh, I can sell it for less by adding these things to it. So essentially, that's what happens. Crack cocaine now is something that is associated with Black people, poor people, inner city people, and cocaine is something that is associated with rich people, wealthy people, white people, etc. Even though it's the exact same drug, literally the exact same drug. But because of who is associated with what drug, you get different sentences based on what you get caught with. So if you get caught with cocaine, you may get 5 years. That same amount of cocaine, that same amount of drugs. So if you get caught with, let's say, 1 gram or 2 grams or whatever, I'm just making these numbers up. 2 grams, you'll get 5 years cocaine. Same 2 grams of crack might get you 12 to 15. Question is, well, why is there that much of a difference? I mean, I can understand you going to prison because you in drug possession, okay. But why won't you get the same amount? Because they're both the same drug. And to this day, there is no good reason. The only reason is because crack is associated with poor Black people and cocaine is associated with rich white people. And to this day, 2021, there is still a discrepancy, laws that say if you have this amount of cocaine, you get a lesser amount of time than if you have this amount of crack. You get a much more amount of time. It's really just that simple. There is no difference in the drug. It's the exact same drug. So again, this goes back to what we're talking about in the reading, how race plays a role in criminality, in drugs, in perception, and how this plays out in the criminal justice system, criminal injustice system in this case. Right. And so these things started again with Ronald Reagan. It was Ronald Reagan who did heavy policing in predominantly inner city areas. So you see way more people who are getting arrested for drugs, drug possessions. They're getting these large numbers, they're doing a lot of time for a little bit of drugs in Ronald Reagan's era. Number one push was drugs. Get all the drug dealers off the streets. Again, the question remains, where are these drugs coming from? How are they getting there? Then you go into what's called the Iran-Contra affair. I won't get into that. That's a whole nother conversation. However, if you want to Google it, you can. If you're interested in this, I don't want to extend this any longer, but if you're interested, I will Google Iran-Contra affair. I would also, if you like just watching shows and series, there's a series called Snowfall. If you've never seen it, it's on Hulu, and it is about all of this. I think they're on a 4th or 5th season, but it is essentially about all of this. And so that's also another really, probably one of the best series. That there's another series, y'all were little. It was about Baltimore. The Wire. The Wire is another series they showed in a lot of college courses, sociology courses. Snowfall is another one that they show. I'm pretty sure they'll start showing that in criminology courses, sociology courses. Yeah, so if you have Hulu, definitely check it out. But that's about all of this stuff. So got Ronald Reagan, and then going into, he also led the campaigns like Dare and Just Say No to make it even more institutionalizing these things even more. And this Ronald Reagan took office in 1981. He coined the slogan, or Nancy Reagan, his wife, coined the slogan, Just Say No, which started to set the stage for a lot of zero tolerance policies around drugs and drug-related incidents. There was a police officer by the name of Chief Daryl Gates who believed that casual drug users should be taken out and shot. That was his idea. If you're a casual drug user, you should be taken out to the streets and shot to death. That same man founded the DARE Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. Now, I know a lot of you are much younger than I am, but when I was in elementary school, DARE was a big deal. This was in the 80s and 90s. DARE was a big deal. It was in every single school. With many of us, dare to be drug-free, blah, blah, blah. Never knowing that the man who started this was somebody who said drug users should be shot and killed in the streets. So in the late 80s, you had this hysteria around drugs, these draconian penalties around drugs. And then this was extended with George Bush Sr. in the 80s, and then Bill Clinton in the 90s. During his 1992 presidential campaign, he said that he would ease up because they saw how the war on drugs was affecting the inner city, was affecting poor Black communities, both people who were not involved with drugs and people who were involved with drugs. And so he said that he would help to fix that, right? By making it less about putting people in prison and more about helping people who need help, right? Clinton rejected the Sentencing Commission recommending to eliminate the disparity, though, between crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentences. So when he got in office, he basically lied. He did not help. In fact, he exacerbated it, right? He rejected the encouragement of drug czars like General Barry McCaffrey, Health Secretary Donna Shalah's advice to end the federal ban on funding for syringe access programs. And then a month before leaving office, he said that we really need to re-examine our entire policy on imprisonment. So he knew it was wrong. But in order to win the election twice, he had to be what? Tough on crime, tough on drugs, because that was what many of the voters at that time, mostly white American voters, but definitely some minority voters as well, wanted, even though he knew it was wrong. That's why he said a month before he left office, essentially it was wrong. He said we need to re-examine our whole policy of people who use drugs. He said that marijuana should be decriminalized because he was known for using marijuana. Whether he did it in office or not, I'm not sure, but definitely Clinton was a smoker, especially in college. Clinton always lauded because employment increased during his time in office. Many people felt he was the greatest president in the modern times. But what many people conveniently forget was while he was increasing jobs, and we can see it if we look at the economy level. The economy level was actually at its highest in like 1998, 99, 2000. So this was right around the time, the end of his time in office. So he's not wrong in that it was some really good times in the modern times, economically, for a majority of Americans. A lot of these jobs were in the prison industry. So yeah, more people had jobs, but they got jobs in prisons because Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton increased the number of prisons in the United States and increased the number of people who were going to prison in the United States. So this kind of lets us know where we are and where we've been with the war on drugs. And since then, it's been grappled with. George Bush Jr. didn't really do much to help because he was dealing with the war on terrorism, and all of that, because shortly after Clinton, then that's when you have 9/11, and then that pretty much takes everybody's attention. But President Obama and even Donald Trump in some ways, and others have tried to do some prison reform. I haven't really seen much with Joe Biden recently with that, but definitely since President Obama, people have been addressing this because this has been a big issue among the American people. Oftentimes when we think about the criminal justice system, we look at shows like Criminal Minds, we look at shows like Law and Order, and we see people get arrested, and in the very next scene, they're in the courthouse and they're arguing a case, and then my client is guilty, my client is not guilty, and this client is whatever. And that's not how it happens. There's usually no quick lawyer, there's no quick due process of law. It takes a lot of time. And so when we go to this next slide, it's important for us to look at some of the myth busters around the criminal justice system. Some of the myths we have to dispel. One, conviction of drug offenses. One thing it's important for us to know is that conviction of drug offenses led to the increased incarceration rates. Increase in incarceration rates. So it was largely drug offenses that created this. As soon as you see the war on drugs, that's when you see the increase in incarceration rates. Why? Because honestly, a lot of people are not breaking the law like that, especially not enough to put people in jail for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Most people aren't doing those kinds of crimes. In fact, drug offenses account for about 2/3 of federal inmate populations, with most people in prison having no history of violence. No history of violence. If it was me, I would say you should only go to prison. You should only go to prison if you do a violent crime. That would be my thought. But there are a lot of people in prison for non-violent crimes. 2/3 of the people in prison are in there for drug offenses, with the majority of them no history of violence. So we really have to re-examine, like Clinton said in the late 90s, how we're looking at drugs, how we punish people who use drugs. and how other countries punish people who use drugs. Not to say drugs are good, not to say that we should let it go, but is it a criminal issue or is it a health issue? If you have big time drug dealers and kingpins, it's understandable that they be arrested. It's understandable that maybe in those cases they be put in prison, right? That's understandable because it's destabilizing a whole society. But then again, I don't know, maybe that's something we need to rethink as well. Should they? Because is it the kingpin's fault or is it the society that is creating within the people a need for it? I think his name was Carlos Slim at one point, a couple years ago. He's not anymore. I think it's Jeff Bezos. But Carlos Slim at one point was the richest man in the world. And he was rich because he owned like cell phones or something, like some big cell phone companies or something. But he was really rich because he was a Mexican drug lord, right? Carlos Slim, Mexican drug lord, at one point was the richest man in the world. Somebody asked him, somebody said, how are you able to why is it that you are okay with supplying deadly substances to people? Like, how does your conscience allow you to sit with that? And he says, you know what? He says, I look at it as a business. I provide something that people want. But I don't look at myself as being the bad guy. I look at the people who are controlling the people that want what I provide. Maybe there's something wrong with their system. For example, he said that the United States is the largest market for what it is that I provide. Okay. The United States sells more drugs there than anywhere in the world. Now, if I go to other places like India or South Africa or certain parts of Africa or places that are poor and I lower the prices, but I can still sell, I don't sell nearly as much drugs, or drugs are not as heavy in those places as they are in the United States. But the United States is the richest country in the world, if not one of them. One of, if not the richest country in the world. So why is it that in the richest country in the world, all of these people are so depressed that they need this product to get away from the reality? Their reality is so amazing. They have big houses, lots of money, all these things. Why are they so depressed? Maybe it's not my product that's making them depressed. Maybe it's the society in which they live. Maybe it's the country in which they live. And maybe the country needs to reevaluate how they treat its citizens and what they do to its citizens, because there are poor countries that don't feel like they need my product, even though they could probably afford it. So again, I'm not saying he's right or he's wrong. A person could take from that and say, he makes a good point, or that's BS, right? You can do whatever you will with it. But the argument, though, again, is that we have to think larger about how we're dealing with the issue of drugs. Is this something that we should completely attack from a criminal perspective, or is this something that we should consider also a health issue? And we know we can consider it a health issue because when it came to crack cocaine, we attacked that from a criminal perspective. But when we deal with the increase of, not opium use, what is the drug that's being used in a lot of these white Midwestern communities, a lot of white communities? I can't remember the name of it, but I think is it opiate? Something. But in recent years, matter of fact, I think I might put that link up there as well. But in recent years, there has been people who've been addressing the large amounts of drug use among white, poor, working class people, particularly in like the Midwestern states. I think it's the opiate crisis or something. I think that's what it is. And they're saying, wow, they're building all these health facilities. I can send y'all, you can Google it. Building all these health facilities. They're not building prisons. They're building health facilities to help get these people off of these drugs. And a lot of comedians, Dave Chappelle, are saying, oh, so now you can build health facilities. But when it was Black people smoking crack, you were building prisons. So again, we got to reconsider how we deal with the issue of drugs. War is often aimed at ridding the nation of drug kingpins. That's a myth. We're trying to get the Carlos Slims of the world. We're trying to get the Noriegas. We're trying to get these big drug dealers. No, because most of the people in prison are not big drug dealers. Very, 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 very few. Most of the people in prison are the local drug dealers. Another myth is that they're concerned with the dangerous drugs. No, that's not true either, because marijuana has already been proven to be less harmful than tobacco or alcohol. But marijuana is responsible for 80% of the drug arrests in the 1990s. Many of those people still in prison to this day. 80% of people who are in jail for drug offenses are in jail for a so-called drug that is less harmful than tobacco or alcohol, which is legal. That is blatant injustice through and through. I don't see where anybody can make an argument for that. So now let's go back to the Fourth Amendment, right? So we're gonna take a step back into history and then move forward to the present day. All right. So if you recall, the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, next slide, says that the right of the people to be secure in their, or gives rights to the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures that shall not be violated. No warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So who knows why the Fourth Amendment was passed, this particular amendment to the Constitution? And this is a part of the Bill of Rights. So this was early on. We're talking maybe 1700s. Why do you think that the early people who are considered to be forefathers and foremothers of this country put this in place? This was because during the American Revolution, or one of the reasons why the American Revolution was fought, was because the British, when America was a British colony, for those who may not be familiar with this story or familiar with American history in this way, the British made these colonies only purchase things, tea, paper, stamps, that were created by the British. Anything that they received from like the Spanish, the Dutch, other countries, it was considered contraband. And when America was starting to get fed up, when these colonies were starting to get fed up with the British, they started to boycott by not purchasing British goods. And they started to get goods from other countries. Well, that was against the law in Britain. And so they started sending soldiers over here to check and see what you got in your house. What's going on? What you got on you? Is it British material? Because if it's not, you're going to jail. And so the colonists could be in their houses with their families, chilling, and all of a sudden someone busts in the room, busts in their house. We're checking everything, turning over couches and chairs and things in there, everything to see what they have to make sure that they don't have contraband, make sure they don't have any materials from other countries. So when the colonists fought the British, America becomes an independent nation. They're creating their own constitution. They remember that. And they say, you know what, we didn't like that feeling. We're not going to treat our people this way. We're not going to search their private property without probable cause. We're not going to come into their homes without a real reason. We believe that the power belongs to the people, not the superiors. And so because the power belongs to the people, we're going to have to go through all the steps in order to properly go into somebody's house, not the people. So that tradition was supposed to extend even to today. And of course, they didn't know anything about cars, but eventually cars were created. And so cars were also part of people's security, your person. That's why if you have a firearm, you can have a firearm in your house, you can have it in your car because it's an extension of you. But because of the war on drugs, a lot of these constitutional civil liberties have been undermined. Terry versus Ohio. Because of that law, if an officer observes unusual conduct by someone, because of this court case, Terry versus Ohio, if an officer observes unusual conduct by someone and believes them to be dangerous or engaging in any criminal activity, they can conduct a limited search to keep or protect themselves or the area. This is called stop and frisk. They can do a limited search without a probable cause. Already this violates the Fourth Amendment outright. But because Terry versus Ohio, because that was I know that was a Supreme Court case, but it was a court case. Because of this court case, it kind of undermined this amendment. You should not be able to search anybody, period. So now they're saying, well, you can do a limited search. This is called the stop and frisk rule. But what's wrong with the stop and frisk rule? What's wrong with conducting a limited search if you have a reasonable belief that somebody is doing something wrong? Think about it. Think about what we talked about, stereotypes, selective perception. What's wrong with that kind of rule? Yes. If you already, because remember what selective perception says, you can go back to the to the definition. Selective perception says individuals engage in selective perception by seeing only the types of behavior that confirm their stereotypes and not those that refute them. If you already have a stereotype or a belief that a Black person is a criminal, that's what you're going to see. And if that's what you see, that's what you think. And if that's what you think, then you're going to say, I have a reasonable suspicion that I need to check your car, that I need to frisk you. If you don't look like the kind of person that a particular officer feels as though should be searched, then they don't feel like they have a reasonable belief, and then you're not going to get searched. And so that law feeds directly into race, directly into selective perception, directly into stereotypes. It corroborates that. It legally gives people permission, essentially, to stereotype certain groups. And who are the groups that will be more likely the victims of it? The ones that are, stop and frisk rule, Black people and Latino people, Latinx people. And yeah, a lot of people fought against it. A lot of people thought it was wrong, but it was illegal for a long time until now, particularly in New York. Why? Again, once you go back, once you look at the documentary, you'll see the story of Khalif Browder. Khalif Browder was a victim of stop and frisk. He had done nothing wrong. They thought he stole a bike, stole a book bag. It was his book bag. He'd done nothing wrong. He was walking home from a party or a school or something in New York. He was arrested, thrown in prison, sent to Rikers Island, one of the worst heavy-duty maximum prisons in the country. This is where big time, big murderers go. Sent to Rikers Island. 17, 16, young. Did 2.5 years at Rikers. Most of the time was spent solitary confinement over a book bag that he did not steal. All he was there because he couldn't afford the bail money to get out. So it took them 2 years to find him a court date. Finally, they said he's been in there long enough. They sent him out. He now has mental issues, but he's trying to work around it. He's trying to finish school. He finishes school, he gets his GED, he goes to college, he's doing well, but because he's out, the police are following him. I think he jaywalks or something. He like crosses the street or something. So now there's a narrative that he's gonna go back to prison because he's under parole because he jaywalked. He's scared. He doesn't want to go back to Rikers. He hangs himself. Why? Because of stop and frisk. That was why they stopped him in the first place. Because of that rule. Real story. You can watch the documentary or you can Google it. It's up to you. Now, because of that, and there was an outrage all over everywhere. So now they have done away with stop and frisk in New York. But he wasn't the first one. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the first victim. He was just the biggest one in modern times. So many victims of stop and frisk. So many people who were victims of this law that was put in place since the 60s. That openly violates the Fourth Amendment. All right, let's go to the next slide. Minor traffic violations. Another thing that they talked about in your reading was how traffic stops are motivated, not by traffic violations, but by a desire to hunt for drugs. Oftentimes, this is called the classic pretext stop. This idea where we're stopping you because you committed a traffic violation. The fact remains, most people commit traffic violations. You probably committed 10 driving to campus. Because there are these very, very small violations. Very like insignificant things that are on the books. So most of us do it. So when we commit traffic violations, they're oftentimes not pulling you over because of the traffic violation. Oftentimes they're pulling you over because they think that you are a criminal. But they can't just pull you over and say, we pull you over because we think you're a criminal, because that is against the law. So they have to find a reason to pull you over. And then once you've been pulled over and then they run your tag, then they can say, oh, you have a charge. Or they can come up to your car and say, oh, I smell marijuana. You don't smell marijuana. I don't even smoke marijuana. I smell marijuana. Get out the car. Now I can search it. That happens all the time. Again, New York, because of all the issues that have happened in New York, they have now done away with that. You can no longer claim to have searched somebody's vehicle because you smell marijuana. Can't do that anymore in New York specifically, not in every state. But most people commit traffic violations, but that's often the reason why. But it's not because of traffic violation, it's because of drugs. So they say, oh, we stopped you because you committed a traffic violation. Now you come up to the car. Oh, I smell drugs. I need to search your car, whether you have drugs or not. You may have something or whatever. Oh, I see a gun, but the gun is mine, is registered. I don't care. You're going to jail. We'll let the judge deal with it. Now you have a record. Now you're in jail. Now you could lose your job because you were on your way to work and now you're not there anymore. But those kind of things happen, particularly in poor and working class inner city neighborhoods. Is there a problem with using these traffic violations as a reason to investigate someone based on a hunch? Yes, because it allows for you to single people out without the action being labeled discriminatory. And guess what? The state courts support this. There's been some changes, but not enough across the country. Each state has not made that illegal yet. Going to the next slide, kissing frogs. Some people argue, well, and this is actually true, many people who do appear in front of the judge are guilty. So people say, oh, well, if you appear in front of the judge and you're guilty, that means the police are doing their job. Not necessarily. Because we only know We think that the police have a sixth sense about criminals. What we don't know is how many people were actually accosted or confronted or accused of doing a crime. And then when they found out that they were innocent, they just threw them back out on the street. Those are the numbers we don't know about. We don't have a record of the innocent people that get harassed by the police often. Because many times they're afraid and they feel like they won't get justice, so they're not going to do a report. Or a lot of times they're poor working class people. They don't have the time to get off work, go to the police station, file a report, fill out all these papers. They're like, you know what? I got kids to feed. I don't have time to do this. So there's a class element to this. The fact is, the police harass a lot of innocent people before they actually get to the criminals. Out of 10 people they might harass, out of 10, 15 people that they may pull over and say they smelled and they can't find anything, they may do that 10, 15 times and then find one and say, we got one. That's the one that ends up in front of the judge, and the judge says, there was weed, there was cocaine. You did have an illegal gun. Go to jail. And those are the things that we see in the statistics. And so we say, the police are really doing their job. No, because it was 9 to 14 people that they did the same thing to that didn't have anything on. She calls that the kissing frogs concept. Kissing frogs concept. Where you have all these people, or essentially where they say, if you kiss enough frogs, you'll find a prince. You probably remember that from the story, the princess who kissed the princess and the frog, something. Princess who kissed the frog and became a prince. He became a prince. If you kiss enough frogs, you'll find one. If you harass enough innocent people, you'll find the guilty one. That's the idea. So every war needs money. Every war needs money. And when the war on drugs started, they needed money to help finance the officers, finance the law enforcement, the judges, the lawyers, the weapons, all of the things that would be needed to fight drugs. And the fact remains, I'm probably going to ask you this, when the war on drugs started, drug use and abuse was actually on the decline. Statistics show people were actually not using drugs as much when they started the war on drugs. And initially, local law enforcement was not on board with it because they was like, no, a lot of people aren't using drugs, not really causing a lot of these. We have bigger fish to fry. We have kids being kidnapped. We have people being shot and killed, not over drugs, over other stuff. That's what we're going to go after, not people who just sitting in their house using drugs, not hurting nobody. So to make drugs a top priority, what the federal government did was offer cash grants. They say, if you make this a top priority, we'll give you a certain amount of money. Oh, okay, well, we'll do that. You want us to go after drug dealers? We'll go after drug dealers. Send over the check. And that's essentially how the war on drugs was financed. Again, going back to the Iran-Contra affair, you can start to see how that's the local story. But if you watch Snowfall, or if you Google Iran-Contra, war on drugs and all that, you can start to see it's much, much bigger than that. There was a program called the Burn Program that was named after a man who died protecting the home of a drug case witness. And this program also encouraged the war on drugs. Because people were saying, see, these innocent people are trying to help folks and they're dying. We got to go out and get these drug dealers. They also offered free training weapons to these local police programs. And by the 1990s, most police forces were on board with this. Most police forces were on board with this program. And this is how you see a huge rise in the 90s with the the war on drugs. Going to the next slide, every war needs weapons. And so before the war on drugs, you had these big weapons, weapons that were used in like Vietnam, weapons that were used in the Korean War, these highly high-tech firearms that were only used for like hijacking, prison escape, like big stuff, people who did big crimes, right? That's when they would use like grenades and tanks and things like that. After the war on drugs, to encourage police officers and local law enforcement agencies to be a part of this war on drugs, they said, we'll teach you how to use these big weapons. We'll give you access to tanks. And so many of these law enforcement agencies said, okay. That's why you can even Google, you can watch in documentaries, you can YouTube. In the 90s, you see big tanks going down a residential street in Los Angeles. Residential street, big tanks pulling up in people's neighborhoods. And they're coming out with these huge weapons and they're ramming them, boom, ramming them, boom. Looking for grams of cocaine. Using grenades, throwing them. I mean, things that they used in Vietnam, they're now using it in New York and in Los Angeles and in Miami. And what do you think is going to happen when you're rolling up like it's a war zone and you're spraying AR-15s in residential areas where kids are going to school, kids are playing on playgrounds? What do you think is going to happen? Innocent people are going to die. Innocent people. You may offer what, a few grams of cocaine? A few pills of crack? These are not the kingpins. These are the local drug dealers. I want you to click that link. I want you to see something. This is a video. I want you to watch it. And then I just want you to think through it. It's really deep. And it's a real story. A real story about how the war on drugs and how the weapons in the war on drugs has impacted innocent people. It's about 4 or 5 minutes. It's not that long. I'm not going, you don't have an assignment on it, but I just want you to watch it. All right, next slide. Where does all the drugs and money go? So some people are asked, all right, so after you go in, and we've seen on movies, we've seen on documentaries, people go in and they get all this money and all this money, all these drugs. And people say, hey, we got a drug bust. And they take the money and they put it in the safe. They take the drugs, they put it in the safe. But we don't know what happens after that. So Michelle Alexander says, well, where does all that money, where does all those drugs go? Once the property is seized by the owner and the owner does not have rights to it anymore, he or she would have to prove the property's innocence. And most of the people who are arrested are poor, so they don't have the money to hire an attorney or pay court costs. And so we start to see how class plays a role in a lot of what is happening here. State and local law enforcement agencies are allowed to keep the assets that they seize. They can keep these. And sometimes some people think that they take it and put the drugs back out on the streets to get more. Some people believe that. Many people don't believe they're taking all those drugs and flushing it down the toilet. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of drugs. Many people don't believe they're just taking the money and saying, okay, we're just going to give it to the poor. I don't think so. So what's happening? A lot of people believe it's seized and somebody's taking it. Then you also have issues with the legal system, not just policing and the law enforcement agencies, but the legal system as a whole. For example, many people, especially poor people who get arrested, who get put in jail, they get poor legal representation. They are given to, what do you call them? Not lawyers, but public defenders. They have like 50 cases, so they're not worried about one person. They got hundreds of pages of paperwork to go through. So they just say, listen, just take a plea deal. I don't have time. Take a plea deal. But I didn't do it. It don't matter. The likelihood of you being found guilty is high. And if you found guilty, you can do 10 years, just do 2. Your mandatory sentence is 10 to 15. 15, you only doing 80% of your time. Maybe you might do 10 to 12. But if you just plead guilty, you will do 2. Just do it. And guess what? About 80% of criminal defendants can't hire a lawyer. And again, with mandatory sentencing being 10, 15, 20 years, if they offer you 3 and you know you didn't do the deed, but they're telling you probably gonna get found guilty, you're gonna be like, you know what, I'll just do 2 years. That's whatever. They make these deals in the middle of the night. Sometimes they're not eating, sometimes they're not sleeping. Sometimes these people will languish in jail for years, like Khalif Browder did, never having a case. And their punishment for drug offenses in this country far exceed the ones in other countries. What people go to jail for in 5 to 10 years here, they might go to jail for 6 months in many other countries. So these are very harsh, draconian drug laws. And so because the laws are so harsh, because the years are so long, people tell on each other. I'm getting 20 years for a first-time drug offense, non-violent. I'm getting 15 years. But if I tell on this person, I'm only getting 5. He did it. He was a part. Now you got all these people. Like, this thing is systematic. And the courts justify mandatory sentencing by saying that it's used to keep violent criminals off the streets. But the reality is most of the people that are victims of mandatory minimum sentencing are nonviolent criminals. So there's a whole legal system that Michelle Alexander is telling us we really have to look at and really have to examine. And then even after a person goes to prison, does their time, gets out of prison, next slide, is their life after prison. It's difficult. Is there life after prison? Yes, there is. But if you are a formerly incarcerated person, you can be barred from public housing, housing discrimination, barred from public housing, you get housing discrimination, ineligible for food stamps, employment discrimination. So you will likely not be able to find a place to stay. You don't get a chance to get food stamps, so you can't get something to eat. A lot of people will not hire somebody who was formerly incarcerated. You can't get a license. So if you can't do all these things, what do? How are you gonna make money? How are you gonna feed yourself or your family? How are you gonna pay your child support? The only way you can. What you know how to do, probably the thing that got you in there in the first place, selling drugs. And then what happens? You get caught, go back to prison. And it's a vicious cycle. That's why it's called the what? The trap. Originally, that was the trap. Now trap and trap music and all that has a different connotation, but back in the 90s, when trap first came out, that was what it was. It was you're in a trap system that's forcing you to do these things. Okay. So, yes, that is your lecture for this week. If you have any questions, reach out to me, email, inbox, office hours. Please don't forget your assignments. Please do not forget your quiz. If you have any questions, if you want to talk about it, if you're interested in any of these topics, feel free to reach out. If you want to send me an email, talk about it, or you just want to come into office hours and talk about any of these things that we're discussing, feel free. I hope you're taking notes for your exams. I hope you are paying attention. You're taking notes for your exams because some of the questions will be off of the lectures, but then some of them will be off of things that I'm talking about in the lecture. So you need to be able to know both. So that is that. Yep, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Look forward to seeing you again, and you will see me again next week.